Hello everyone, I'm Simon Bembo, Learning Manager for Springboard, and I'd like to welcome you to this review of the reopening of retail. Today we're going to look at the lead up to and the first 2 weeks of retail reopening. Before that, I'll hand over to Diane for a brief overview of Springboard, then I'll talk about how to read comparison charts before we get down to the nitty-gritty.
Hello everyone, I'm Diane Worrell, Springboard's Marketing and Insights Director. For anyone who isn't familiar with Springboard, I thought it would be helpful to give a quick tour of what we do. We deliver data and insights on customers in destinations and also in bricks and mortar stores. Our key metric is footfall, that's the volume of customer activity, and we track footfall across the UK. We have a network of counters tracking footfall continuously 24 hours a day at around 4,500 locations, and we cover around 250 towns and cities. This map shows our coverage in high streets, and you can see that we track footfall across all regions of the UK. Our coverage includes all of our regional cities, but also a huge range of towns of different sizes and functions, from large town centres to small local high streets. In fact, we've adopted what we call a hub and spoke approach to our coverage, ensuring that every regional city is included, as these are the hubs of economic activity within each region, but then also smaller towns in the region. This means that in any one region, we're tracking footfall in towns that account for around 2/3 of all spend. And nationally, this has ensured that the correlation between our coverage and spend nationally is very high. In fact, around 93%. So our data accurately represents the retail landscape across the UK. The relevance of our footfall data is demonstrated by the fact that we're a partner of the High Street Task Force, delivering footfall data so the task force can understand high street performance. And we also provide data to both BEIS, the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and the ONS, the Office of National Statistics. And in fact, our data features in the ONS's weekly Faster Indicators report that tracks the impact of COVID-19 on economic activity.
Thanks Di. I'm going to now quickly look at comparison charts and the differences in how they are read. Starting with the week-on-week charts, these can sometimes come across as if there's some wild fluctuation happening in the data. The first thing to do is to remember that this is not showing actual footfall, or whatever measure you're analysing, but is actually showing the difference compared to the previous week. There's often an instinct to be worried about peaks and troughs, but they can usually be easily explained with a little thought. To demonstrate, this set of made-up data shows a couple of nice increases in footfall along with one drop, which might instinctively be worrying. However, let's overlay the actual footfall and see what this shows us. Now we can see that there's actually a nice footfall pattern and the peaks and troughs are easier to understand. There are 3 general rules you can use when looking at week-on-week data. First, small changes imply a consistency with the previous week, and this is apparent in weeks 1 to 5. Secondly, a change in one direction immediately followed by a change in the opposite direction suggests a short-term event, for example Easter, and this can be seen as an example here in weeks 6 and 7. Notice that although the percentage change week on week for week 7 looks bad, actually this is just the data returning to its previous level after the event of week 6. Last rule is a big change followed by small changes is an indicator of a longer term change or event and can be seen here in weeks 10 to 13. Data has increased in week 10, then, as per rule 1, it's remained consistent across the following weeks. Examples of this could be school holidays or, given our subject matter, the reopening of retail. Moving now to year-on-year charts, and these are somewhat more straightforward to read. If this year's data is tracking last year's, there'll be a small or consistent year-on-year change. This can be seen in weeks 10 to 13 in the example. This year is higher, and so the percentage change numbers are consistent, even if they're a bit hard to see on this chart. We can immediately see the issue that we're all experiencing at the moment comparing our current data with the previous year, and it's the huge year-on-year change where things were closed down last year. Now there are a number of times where this might happen. Obviously there are the lockdowns and tiered restrictions which were imposed over the last 13 months, but you might also see this if there are major building works in your high street. When you come back around to the same time of year, comparing year-on-year figures, they might not really tell you all that much. Of course, there is a massive jump on last year. We were in lockdown, or that road was closed to the public. But what are we actually interested in these cases? It's how close to normal we are now. Hence, we need to change our comparison data set to something that's normal, but that still takes into account the time of year, and that's when we compare to 2 years ago. In our current situation, that means comparing 2021 to 2019. Now comparing the data to 2 years ago, we can see there's more consistency in the comparison data sets. Of course, there will still be some blips. The example of Easter always comes to mind, given it's shifting around year by year. This could be seen in weeks 5 and 6 in this example, week 5 being Easter 2 years ago and week 6 being Easter 2021. As you can see, this gives us a much better idea of how the high street is performing compared to normal times. Hopefully this also demonstrates the usefulness of this method following events other than just lockdowns. In summary, for comparison charts, here are the 3 general rules I mentioned earlier for week on week, plus a few points to think about when you're considering using year on year, but compared to 2 years ago rather than last year. And lastly, before we move on to the retail reopening review, a quick reminder of the comparison calculation. Just remember the golden rule with this. The previous period can be whenever you like, as long as the time period is identical to the current period. For example, if one is 7 days, so must the other be. It does mean that the previous period can be last week, last year, 2 years ago, or as far back as you like. Now we'll look at the data for what feels like the long-awaited reopening of retail. First, let's take a look at the overall UK results. Increases in footfall in 10 of the 14 weeks of lockdown indicate a pent-up consumer demand pre-reopening. The increase in footfall in week 15 was nearly double our forecast figure, better news than we'd hoped for. Moving now to high streets in England only, we can see the uplift in week 15 was actually even greater. By removing the devolved nations whose lockdown rules differ, we can see the actual result of retail reopening across English high streets. Those increases in high street footfall in the build-up to reopening are generally higher than across the UK as a whole, mainly because retail and shopping parks remain less affected by the retail restrictions. Although they did also see an increase in footfall in week 15, it was a more muted increase due to the nature of the outlets that are located there, supermarkets and other essential retail. As discussed at the beginning of the webinar, the drop in week 16 is not really a cause for great concern. This is more like footfall settling to the new normal after the initial burst of retail therapy and was expected. Note that the slight drop in week 16 for high streets is a smaller fall than that seen across the UK, so good news for high streets. It has been noted that other commentators have mentioned evening footfall being the key driver of the return to high streets. However, our data shows that daytime footfall has increased by similar levels week on week, and given the higher level of footfall during the day, it remains, in my opinion, the driver of our return to normal. To understand how we're currently performing against the old normal, we're comparing here 2021 against 2019, as we discussed earlier in the webinar. This shows that at its lowest point, English high streets were attracting almost 3/4 less footfall than at the same time in a normal year. But the enormous uplift in high street footfall in reopening week means that the gap between 2021 and 2019 has reduced by 2/3. But high street footfall is still over a quarter lower now than it was at this point in 2019. Just to touch back upon the day parts, here we can see the change against 2019 for English high streets. And compared to 2019, daytime footfall has clearly been more resilient, likely because while some retail has been open throughout, hospitality has not been so lucky. It also adds to the idea that hospitality is going to take longer to recover. Now, back to the good news of reopening. There were significant rises in footfall across all types of high street and high street signature. The greatest rises were in central London and other large city centres regionally, while by signature, comparison towns were the winners. It should be noted, however, that despite the significant rise in footfall in London and other large cities in reopening week, the decline from 2019 was still much larger than in smaller towns, a result of the loss of their working population, tourists, leisure goers and shoppers, with smaller high streets continuing to be more resilient. The loss of tourism is evident in the larger annual declines in holiday and specialty towns. It's a bit too early to be able to draw any long-term conclusions, but this chart shows us the percentage change in footfall week on week in English high streets since reopening. The first week since reopening had massive increases as expected, and perhaps predictably the biggest peak was on day 1, followed by the first Saturday of retail being open again. Looking at the data for the second week and beyond, we can see pretty consistent drop throughout the week, with Monday having the largest drop week on week. This is to be expected after the initial excitement of being able to shop again. Most other days show a slight fall on the week of the 12th, but remember that these are week on week figures, so actually the footfall is still much improved over the pre-reopening period. Notice that Saturday in the second week has actually increased slightly over the first week. Good news for weekends going forward perhaps. We track footfall each day, so we will be watching these results carefully. If you're interested in a deeper dive into the performance of bricks and mortar retail, then join us for our Reopening of Retail webinar. You can sign up to this by going to the Springboard homepage. There's an e-banner on our page where you can sign up. Thank you for your time today. I hope you found some useful information in this webinar. Until next time.